Clients would say, oh, these people don't understand the economy. They understand much better often than the critic does. And if we're to avoid this, the critical importance is not to allow aspirations in our country to die. You've got to sell the message that your life can get better.
Hi everyone, I'm Petrus and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've watched some of our content so far and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Dr. Frans Cronje. Dr. Cronje directs the Center for Risk Analysis and has advised several hundred South African corporations, foreign investors and policy shapers. He's the author of 3 books on South Africa's future, and the scenarios from these books have presented to more than 30,000 people. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Good evening. Great to be here.
So, we always have this scenario, especially with experts on, economics or politics or, even history, to try and peer into their crystal ball and predict a bit of the future for us. Because that's what viewers really like to, they want to know. They want to know what the future is. They feel more comfortable about it. I know that you are an expert for risk analysis. In other words, you actually analyze the probabilities and then look what the future can contain and how we can prepare for it. Could you perhaps just give us a brief rundown of the possible scenarios that South Africa will head towards in the coming years?
The advice always is to be very skeptical of people like me. The track record of the analyst community in calling great global or local transitions isn't great. We think we understand many of the reasons for that. You can take me into that later this evening if you choose to. But right now, we think it's two things. If you imagine in your minds a matrix, so there's an axis running up and down and an axis running across your screen. So you've got 4 quadrants. The points of the up and down axis, the top one is the ANC stays above 50% of the vote. And you can take me tonight into whether that will happen. The bottom one could be the ANC loses an election this decade. The right-hand points, like compass points, this one over here is someone runs the country, is going to drive a reform agenda. This one is it's never going to happen. You read our compass in its 4 quadrants. So up here, where my hand is, the ANC is above 50 and reform has happened. So Cyril has done it. His long game has occurred. It's a success. The economy is growing quickly. People have jobs. It's a democracy. It's amazing up here. Down here, what has happened is the ANC has lost an election in order to create the room for someone else to come along and drive reform. It's the next great political transition. My clients say, you're crazy. The government can change. We say to them, not so fast. The reason we became a democracy 30 years ago was surely that if a point were reached where the country was not well governed to the benefit of its people, they might vote differently. It's not as alarming and amazing as it seems. And I said to you in the opening, analysts get it wrong because they don't call the great transitions. And the reason is they're too scared to do it because you sound like a lunatic. So down here, we're going to go through a great new political transition. The ANC's gone. It's lost, kaput, finished, away. There's a new group running the country, and they're driving reform. It's going to happen this decade. Bottom left is a terrible place. We don't want to go there. The ANC's below 50, and no one is driving reform. It's chaos, turmoil, pandemonium. Perhaps the ANC's lost. The EFF has come in to bail them out of trouble. The Malema is essentially running the new conflagration. It's horrendous. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and worse than that. And I've had clients over the years have said to me, you can't say that. Us, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Yes, you can say that. There's nothing about our country, its history, its place in the world, or its people who are great. I'll tell you more about that later. That makes us so special that we can't become a hellhole. And then top left, no reform, but the ANC has stuck it out. That is where we can go. Within the confines of your screen, we call it the game board, there is no fifth result. I have to bet my reputation on that. Nothing can happen that's not in one of these quadrants. So the answer to your question has become a lot simpler because we've started with where we might head towards, which is always the
quite vague.
The difficulty. Now we're faced with the question of, well, which of the four is it? So, here's this guy, he's the analyst, surely now he'll tell us. I will tell you if you give me 2 minutes to qualify my answer. We start like this for our serious clients. We work for bankers and all sorts of important people. And we make them think about the world like this. And the reason is we tell them, if you've got a top-end management team and you can think on your feet and you can turn on a dime and you can develop proto-strategy in advance of great uncertainties, then it really matters a lot less to you because you can see the early indicators and you can adjust accordingly. The people who get crushed are the people who say, where the hell did that come from? And my job is to put my big clients in a position where they're never going to say, what the hell was that? Yeah. Why did no one tell us? Yeah. Then you're fine. After you've become fine and robust, you can do it as an ordinary family. You can make life decisions that make you very robust. For me, I do this. I live here. I love the place. I'm very worried about the country for its own sake. I'm not very worried about my narrow personal sake because we've hedged on the options. Yeah. Do that is my advice. After that, we can speculate about which one it's going to be. Up here, Cyril's going to lead a great transition. Ain't going to happen. He's not a reformer. That's the problem. It stops the clients cold. Why doesn't Cyril drive reforms? Answer, he's not a reformer. That's the problem. There's a dearth of reformers in the ANC. I've got a lot of details, some data for you. You can tease that out of me later. Bottom right, ANC is going to lose an election and someone else brings around reform. Absolutely plausible. I actually lean down there. South Africans are great. Poll them, which we do, and you see that what the mainstream media and social media tells you of hate festivals, worst relations ever, drive each other into the sea, it's crap, actually. Most South Africans, good 7 out of 10, are moderate in their opinions. They want the same thing out of the country, and they're super pragmatic, and they respect each other across lines of race and class and history. And we remain a fundamentally free society. I can come on your show, I can say Cyril's not going to do it, he's not a reformer. Thus far, the Gestapo don't drag me away in the middle of the night. We also poll the ANC, and it's in terrible trouble. Amongst people under the age of 50, ANC support has now fallen to below 50%. Max life expectancy in South Africa is around 65. There's been a block of voters, now increasingly aged by South African standards, who've kept the ANC in power. And they've done so not because there's something wrong with them or they're mad. They've done so because they remember, they have the living memory experience of what the country was like under apartheid. Right. And they know that it's better, and it's better today than it was then. Younger people don't have that frame of reference. They're crushing the ANC. So, bottom right, we're a free society. ANC support is sinking. The relationship between ANC support and the economy is very strong. It's actually just on the cold analytics, which is how you must do this stuff. It looks pretty strong. As I told colleagues last week, the only thing that's missing is at the moment someone who can beat the ANC. Yeah. But we'll get there. When Mr. Obama was inaugurated, he said, yes, we can. 1 million people in the mall in Washington. You said to him, listen, dude, it looks amazing, but the next guy to stand there is going to be Donald Trump.
Mm.
He would have told you there's no way. If you told civil rights activists in America in the 60s when they were being beaten up for trying to walk into diners that were segregated, that in your lifetime, Americans will elect a black man and put him in the White House, they would have told you they don't think it will happen. If you make a South African example, if you told the ardent Nationalist Party supporters after P.V's Rubicon speech in 1985 that there's less than a decade left and the Nats will join the ANC and the last Nat leader will become the ANC's tourism minister, they would have said to you, "Now it's too much." The too much happens all the time. So we like bottom right. Bottom left is terrifying, but it's perfectly plausible, as I've said to you. There is very little by way of reform thinking within the government. In business, there's virtually nothing.
Yeah.
And much of civil society pushes a leftist agenda, which, couched in all the terms of justice and the like, if translated into policy, sinks the country's economy and drives investors out. That frightens us. It's a perfectly realistic place to end up. I'll do proportions for you now. Top left is a bit of a cop-out. It's the question, can you sit in this holding pattern for another decade? Yeah, maybe you can. Probabilities, let's try. But you've heard my earlier warning. Top right, the great reform is coming. It's imminent. We'll, by the end of this decade, be led by the ANC and the economy will be growing at the average of emerging market rates by this ANC, not some new ANC that emerges. I don't know, 10%.
Yeah.
Bottom right, ANC is going to lose and something new comes along and turns the country on a decade-long view. I can't make it higher than 50 because that's too much for me. I'd give you about 35, 40%. Now I've used up 50%. I'll split the rest between the other two. Have no doubt we are in trouble now as a country. We're in deep trouble. But we've been in trouble before and we've turned. And when countries turn, then I'll be quiet and take another question. When countries turn, it's not luck or happenstance or that someone came and saved us. It's that society shift, the shifts that trigger, that follow transitions, always follow the direction of the group that had the greatest influence on public opinion at the moment of the crisis. There was an enormous lobby driven here in the 60s and 70s and 80s to make sure that when apartheid collapsed under the weight of its contradictions, it would go one way. That lobby is absent this time round, which means that all your scenarios are in play. But the point of it is that you as an ordinary chap sitting at home, you can actually do a great deal to influence where this is going next. So that's my opening for you.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. It touched on so many points that we want to discuss, and I think we'll actually use this as a basis to talk about a lot of the different, questions that we have there. Because this is the analysis that you've put forward in several other podcasts so far, and this is the part that we kind of want to play out. We want to see the different elements thereof. But I want to touch on a few things first before we get to some new questions. The first one is where you said that if you are not willing to make bold claims for your clients, that they won't believe you. And then you gave a couple of examples of in history where somebody said that this will be the future case, and if you mentioned to them saying this is what the future will be, they at that point would have said no, that's way too bold of a claim. So the point being is bold claims have happened in the past and people at the time weren't willing to accept them. So it's the probability of these different scenarios that you're really analyzing, that you're looking at the statistics and the data and the polling and what the possibilities are. And some of them are very bold claims, but statistics show that it's quite likely this will happen. So in this regard, you say that we shouldn't really take analysts too seriously or write on their predictions very much. But how successful has your predictions been over the past few years, given this model as a basis?
Yeah, on the whole, we think we've been pretty good, and we think the balance haven't been. Now that's bold. What were the really big calls? Let's go back to the organization that gave rise to us. It gets the call right. I mean, I'm too young. I was at school. It gets the call right in the early 80s already that apartheid's done and that it's going to be a peaceful transition. Second big call came about a decade later that in government, the ANC might be more pragmatic than feared out of Eastern Europe. Many reasons for that, one of which was the understanding, I think, that Mandela and Mbeki knew. You certainly saw it in Mandela's comments after his speech in Davos, a very important moment in 92, that the wreckage they were inheriting economically was so wreckage that if they did not grow, they would be in the arms of the IMF by the end of the 1990s. And the revolution was done. What's the point? And it was to avoid that some pretty pragmatic reforms were introduced. Now, there's a dispute in my office about what later happened. Was it a sincere attempt at reform, or was it a more sinister attempt at doing what every good revolutionary should, which is to harness the capitalist economy to the revolutionary agenda of the state? That dispute's never really been settled. It doesn't matter terribly much so, though, because it all came to an end in Polokwane in December of 2007, when in the ejection of Thabo Mbeki, the ANC in fact jettisons more than the man. It jettisons the pragmatism that had come out of the Davos speech in 92. We called that in a sense. I mean, we had the sense of it. I remember an exchange with Mbeki and his office in Business Day ahead of the December conference. One of his sort of people had said that we were being very rude and were threatening the revolution. And we'd responded by saying, don't worry, the revolution will take care of you by the end of the year, which it subsequently did. Then came Jacob Zuma. And Zuma, I still maintain we had him right. He wasn't an ideologue. He was the least ideological leader the ANC had. He did not care much about ideologies. But he did surrender the policy space in the country to his relative leftist backers in the Communist Party and CUSATU. Political circumstances, we can go into that later, had led to that. And we must remember that it was Zuma's caucus in the ANC that voted against expropriation without compensation. Mr. Ramaphosa's is driving it to its conclusion. On Mr. Ramaphosa himself, when he was, first he comes to Nasrec. And ahead of Nasrec, I had on our behalf, I'm sure, leaked in a sense some data on the ANC branches, which we'd been able to refine. And in a note shortly before the Nasrec conference to clients, to show that we really didn't know, I said along the lines that if you put all the data into a spreadsheet and press the button, it tells you Mr. Ramaphosa is going to win by 0.2% or something, which was to say we don't know. It turned out to be that, not because we knew it. It was just one of those moments when you get it right. More importantly, afterwards, our clients were in rapture. It was the beginning of the new dawn, literally. And the best I could do, because they wouldn't listen, was to remind them of the apocryphal tale of Richard Nixon's visit to Beijing in, I think, 1972, when he is said to have asked the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, what do you think the impact was of the French Revolution? To which Enlai's beguiling response, apocryphal, but too good, you must pretend it's real, said it's too soon to tell. And we said to our clients, too soon to tell. And I remember briefings around that era. I remember one for a group of diplomats of European extraction, where I said, I don't think this guy's a reformer. Silence in the room.
Nobody believed you.
No, it was terrible. This time we'd got it wrong, because he was a very great man. A capitalist, a business industrialist, and undoubtedly a reformer. 3 years later, we're doing okay in the client world. People have some come crawling back and said maybe you guys had a point, and there were reasons for all our calls. So on the main macro stuff, I think we've on the big call, peaceful transition. They're not going to nationalize the economy on day one, the ANC and government. Mbeki is not going to make it. Zuma is not an arch ideologue, but has terrible character flaws, as we've learned. And Ramaphosa is not a reformer. At each juncture, at odds with the mainstream, and often to the point of inducing ridicule. I think the record's been okay. Why has it been okay? We don't tolerate political correctness in the analysis team, number one. Number two, we try and find out what's really going on. What are people thinking? 2, 3, we don't employ economists. I don't think we do. Maybe, there's one sort of at the moment. But we, historians, psychologists, these are the skills you need to understand the decisions that people take about the countries they run. And if you look at the state of the world, they don't often take very good decisions.
Yeah. Well, this I also want to talk a bit more about the 4 areas that you've explained, the political compass. And it's a different type of political compass, but it's a type of political compass in the 4 scenarios it proposes. The top right one, where there's no reform and the ANC maintains above 50%. We've already talked about some of the elements why this is highly improbable. For example, the age distribution of the people that still vote for the ANC, like you've mentioned. We'll get a bit more in terms of like their strategies of keeping voters going to the future. So how this might be possible, but I want to ask you specifically with regards to the corrupt faction of the ANC, which is under a lot of fire, especially with their connections to Jacob Zuma and the trial is currently undergoing. What do you think is the likelihood of them actually prevailing? Like, can they actually get rid of Ramaphosa and achieve their goal, or will they actually use Ramaphosa to achieve their goal? What do you think the scenario there is?
I don't think there's a corrupt faction. I think there are 2 factions. Well, it depends how you look at the world, but essentially let's play along with the mainstream. There's the Ramaphosa faction, and then there's the Ace Magashule faction.
Yeah.
Which one's the corrupt faction? Well, the Ace Magashule faction is, by all accounts, spectacularly corrupt.
Yeah.
The Ramaphosa faction is not made up exclusively by people who would sleep well at night, knowing that a ferocious prosecution service was on the prowl. We didn't assess background checks on the executive committee of the ANC. Now, the executive committee is the management committee. If you know a lot of political things, it's the Politburo. And it's got 80 ordinary members. Now, we went, well, how do you do that? Well, we're not a law enforcement agency, so you take the person's name and you gather all the information you can. 41 of the 80 are implicated in allegations. That's all they are. They could be perfectly innocent. But they're implicated in allegations of serious corruption. 8 are not implicated. 9 are not implicated. 31, we can't tell you.
Okay.
Now, Cyril has the balance of power inside that committee, undoubtedly, and in the caucus. The trouble with the ANC analysis, this thing of a corrupt faction and another faction has a history that you chaps must understand. When Mbeki was defeated at Polokwane 10 years before that, the takeover it's 2 factions that do it. Yeah. The left loathe Mbeki and Mandela because they say they're traitors. They sold out the revolution. They didn't nationalize everything. And the other faction that did it was the sort of ethno-nationalists that arose around Jacob Zuma. And these loathed each other. We must warn you, when you finished with us, you're more confused than when you started. But we like to leave our clients there because that's the real world. These 2 factions remove Mbeki because they have a common interest in his departure, but they loathe each other. In government, now in charge, they set off to govern the country. And I mentioned to you earlier that Jacob Zuma kind of left policy making to his strange leftist bedfellows who were too delighted that they had, to use the revolutionary term, won back the levers of power denied to them by gear. The economic policy, the good one of the ANC.
Yeah.
And the Zumites and the ethno-nationalists went on to loot the place. The consequence was disastrous because governance was now collapsing in institutions. Policy was moving back to the Soviet Union of the 1950s, and we drove that thing straight through the global financial crisis. Screwed. We went from a position of a budget surplus, a country where in the decade since 94, the ANC had cut debt levels in half. The growth rate was back to 5% sustainably, which it hadn't been since the first half of the 1960s. And we sunk that completely. The budget deficit now, which had been in surplus, is now as deep as it has only been on 3 previous occasions. The most recent was the collapse of apartheid in the 80s following the speech of Ph.D. in 85 and Chase Manhattan's concurrent decision to cut off South Africa's money. Prior to that, you must go to the Second World War or the First World War to find a fiscal hole as deep as that the ANC finds itself in today. So disaster happened. Support for the ANC politically crashed. So that story must be done away with, that the ANC is immune to poor governance. Its supporters are deserting it in droves because they're perfectly normal people in the main and not so ideologically obsessed as the government likes to think. The protest actions in the country, the level of violent anti-government protest increased, I can establish, by at least 300%. I mean, it's a disaster. Confidence in the future of the country. Are you confident in the future? A polling question. About 7 out of 10 South Africans had been at the peak of Mbeki's success. That would fall to 20% or thereabouts. The two, are you confident in the future? Yeah. ANC supporters say no, and then vote for the ANC, which we'll discuss later. The ANC high command in Luthuli House is very well informed on the country. Make no mistake. This idea that they're too dumb to understand is completely wrong, as I remind my clients. They understand. They just see the opportunities in the demise and alarmed at the consequences. And that sets off a fight between the left of the party that's come back after Polokwane and the ethno-nationalists about who's to blame for this disastrous performance. And out of that, very carefully, the left wing couches the term state capture to tell the public the reason it's such a mess is because they stole a lot of money. Zuma and the Guptas and now S. Makashula's joined the... It's brilliant, and it works because it's partly true. But it totally circumvents, which is in the interests of the left, the fact that that is not alone the explanation. The economy hasn't tanked because the Guptas stole all the money. It just doesn't make any sense. Arresting the Guptas, putting them in jail, won't take the growth rate back to 5%. The other half of the explanation is that leftist influence on policy has had a crippling effect on the country's competitiveness, exacerbated by looting and stealing. The success of that narrative carries Cyril Ramaphosa to power. We'll stop the state capture. We'll have a committee even, and then it will stop, and then we'll be successful. It doesn't work. But it remains the narrative to this day that there's a corrupt faction and there's a good faction, and we must join the good and fight the bad. It's every fairy tale ever written. It's a very powerful human story. It's a story of most religions. So it works. But on the ground, it's wrong because both factions are deeply compromised by corruption, because the institutionalization of corruption has regrettably proceeded to a point where this great liberation movement, which has a long and storied history, the ANC, whatever you think of it, people who understand it badly, they don't know the history. If you know it properly, it's a very, very important organization. But on governance, it has now reached a point of no return. And it doesn't really matter which side wins, because the depth to which patronage networks finance it in order to hold it together is not fundamentally different. I mean, it's a question of degree, of course, but it's not fundamentally different between the two factions. It's a common analytical mistake. And you're thinking about South Africa, a whole new world of options opens when you begin to consider that nice, easy, good versus bad cliche probably doesn't apply to the internal contestations of the ANC today.
Yeah, but I mean that's the part that exactly the people that may, I mean, they follow the general narrative because they don't spend enough time to analyze this in the way that you do necessarily. But they're afraid that the new narrative might win. For example, that the left part of the ANC, which have largely broken off and became the EFF, or at least the most I want to say verbal, or the ones that carry the narrative the strongest, have broken off and become the EFF. They're the ones that's scared that's going to going to win, and see how that scenario is going to turn out. I just quickly want to, before we get into that specifically, I just want to ask one more question regarding this corrupt scenario. We have a situation where a lot of this economic deficit that you've now mentioned is being almost want to say, that they're holding the gates by means of foreign investment. And this foreign investment, in large part to the state enterprises, comes from various global powers, for example, China as being among them. What role let me ask first, is this even true? Like, are they actually holding the gates? Are they actually having that big of an impact? And if they're having an impact, what is that impact? What role are they currently playing, this foreign influence? And also, does the other side of the coin, which, globally people see as the United States, even have an influence at all? Or is it mostly us and China?
Okay, big question that. Lots of components. On the broader fixed investment to GDP levels in South Africa, let's start there. That's been on a downward slope for the better part of a decade. And that domestic investor sentiment won't be fundamentally different to foreign. R.W. Johnson, who's an analyst and is very good, although he's not popular, the two often go together. Johnson, I saw brilliantly before this pandemic, after Ramaphosa's election, address an audience of terribly well-heeled people. And Johnson was saying Ramaphosa's not a reformer. And the audience, sort of black tie thing, were starting to moan loudly from the floor. You could hear the cries of horror. How could such a man say such a thing? Johnson was brilliant. He stopped them. He said, put up your hand. If you brought your money back into the country after Ramaphosa was elected president of the ANC. Then he said, okay, let's carry on now. Okay, we no hands. Investor sentiment, domestic won't be different to foreign. The major impact is that the fixed investment levels are sliding. That's why growth is sliding. That's why job creation is nowhere in a decade. That's why we're in a position today, and this is a stonker, where less people go to work every day than when Thabo Mbeki was kicked out of his office. That's more than a decade. How's that? So investor sentiment, occasionally you do get the opportunity to brief the ANC. And it's very interesting. But a point that I don't think is challenged is to say, listen, all the rhetoric, all the noise, all the media, all the bullshit you put into the mainstream, you look at the scoreboard, you know what investment sentiment towards you is, and you know
Yeah.
the impact of your policies, and that is accepted. We'll go later into why that doesn't worry the ANC. This is a terrible mistake my clients make. They say, well, thank goodness the government, you say, understands what causes the problem. And I say, yes, and the client looks relieved. And you say, you mustn't be relieved, because it doesn't follow that now you're therefore going to introduce reform. That's a critical understanding. But the overall understanding is undoubtedly there in the government that its policies cause very great harm.
Yeah, and the foreign so basically
the foreign understanding's the same. It's a funny pantomime I found, the world of analysis, because serious people know the truth, and I don't mean to be rude about the man on the street, as it were, but I think a great many people travel through the world consuming news, media, and insights and the like that do not lead them in the right direction in terms of their thinking. They think there's a great contest to win investment for South Africa. Good is fighting evil. I said in a client note recently, St. George could slay this dragon, but he's choosing not to. He'd rather lop off its ear so that the people will see him drenched in the blood of the ear and think he's fighting for us. Let's give him some more money and make him even vote for him again. And foreign investors completely understand. So the crushing effect on the economy is there. In private, there's very little dispute about what's happening. I think the American administration of Mr. Trump was very pragmatic about South Africa. And I mean, remember, Americans on Africa have this horrible experience of Somalia. And Africa is terribly far away, and it probably all looks the same. The last time they went, they made a film about it. So there's a great aversion to get involved. You don't have anything, I'd say, now on that side of the Atlantic of the caliber of the influence and lobby that existed under President Reagan, which was very engaged and involved in fighting for liberty. And I would say to an extent, even now, to what extent do the occupants of the White House in America now act actually in favor of substantive human liberty in America? I think that's in doubt, let alone here. I don't think anyone's from Europe. The sense of the guilt of colonial rule is tremendous. You don't want to interfere here, particularly if it's a hot issue like expropriation. Chinese, as ever, brilliant and patient, and think South Africa is too volatile to commit much money to at this time. Maybe you can pick it up at bargain basement price in a few years' time. But there's no, I mean, the Russians tried some things under Mr. Zuma with their nuclear story. I don't think it was ever really a big nuclear transaction. I think it was actually an oil transaction. But that was all undone when Mr. Ramaphosa won at Nasrec. So foreign influence on South Africa, I think, is... I think we're going to chart our own path. I don't think there are any external influences that are going to commit much by time or money to setting us right or wrong. But there is immense goodwill towards the country in the Western world. And if we make the right, sensible, pragmatic decisions here, we will win with such support, particularly in the current climate in America. I think if we take pragmatic decisions, I think the Biden administration will be very generous in its support, as have been all. I mean, AGOA and as a vastly generous American gift to South Africa and to Africa, particularly South Africa. PEPFAR, the health program, is immensely generous. And for many years, Americans always said, you mustn't say this in case Mr. Trump hears it. But South Africa, I haven't looked recently, ran for years and years a trade surplus with the United States, which was one of very few trade surpluses we ran. We didn't run one really with anywhere, certainly not with our friends in China. So the goodwill is there, but I think on the global thing, look in-house. It's up to us. We make good pragmatic decisions. We play China off against the US, which should be our foreign policy. We can do tremendously well out of that. As it is, my sense is that from without, the view is it's a great pity what's happening in your country, but we don't have the long-term view to get involved in a substantive way.
In fact, in a lot of individual perspectives that I've seen online with people, is in most cases, it's people that complain, that live in South Africa, that complain about the scenario, usually tied to some bit of news that's quite bad, would then say just get out, like just leave it. You know, it'll Zimbabwe, it'll Venezuela itself now. Just get out while you can. So that's kind of the sentiment there. So they don't really want to get involved. They actually want the people that are complaining or feeling sad about the scenarios to actually get out of it. But I actually want to touch on something else, which you mentioned, which was the ANC has realized that economic growth is not actually good for them as a political party in the way that it actually bleeds votes. I mean, you've mentioned that through is it through polling, or is it just through talking of ANC members that this thought is quite pervasive among them? And you say that they understand the problem, but they don't actually want to solve it. They just want to cut off the dragon's ear and show like they're trying to kind of do it to try and solve the problem. But if they don't solve the problem, this is inevitably going to be a short-term solution. I mean, they are bleeding votes. That's definitive. And if they stifle the economic growth, the left part is going to gain more support. So they're still going to bleed votes. Like, why is this thought still going on? I mean, it looks like it's going bad for them both ways.
You give me a bit of leeway here because it's hard to make this clear. I agree with your sentiment. I wouldn't put it quite as starkly as you do, but here's something. Amongst people whose highest level of education is primary school, the ANC polls the most strongly on the education spectrum. Whereas amongst people with a university degree, we poll them at about 30% now, the ANC. People with primary school, we put up in the 60s, around there. University degree, and it's a sliding scale. And lots of that. We see income levels, we see the same. The middle classes have gone. The fissures on ANC support are as much socioeconomic now as racial. Outside of our polling, where will you see this evidence? Where's the evidence? You know, people are worried about polling. Sarah Palin famously said when the campaign with McCain was crashing in America and she was asked about this, she said polls are for strippers and skiing, which was great. But polls have their use to a point. I think ours are particularly good. Where is the ANC losing? Deep rural heartlands of the Eastern Cape and Natal? No, it's the cities. It's the emerging middle class. It's the aspirant, probably employed, more likely employed than not, in other words, by our standards. Emerging middle class. Amongst people with jobs, the ANC now polls for us below 50%. Amongst the unemployed, it polls well above 50. Amongst people who are unemployed and not looking for work, it is the highest we can get it. I think it's approaching 70. If you are of the, let's make it the world simple again, there's the Ramaphosa camp and then there's the Ace Magashula camp. If you're of the view of the Ace Magashula camp and you get put in a position where you can do something on education policy or on the labor market that will greatly improve things, better schooling and more jobs, you would be perfectly right to worry that you will feed a class of political actor who will remove you from power and then insist that you're sent to prison for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
That is the imminent danger you're in. Because you can go to prison now. It's not hypothetical. It's not theoretical. It's not a possibility. If the country is well governed, becomes middle class, the rule of law prevails, how's Ace Magashula not going to get himself into prison if what is alleged of him is true? On the other hand, if you don't fix schools, if you don't create jobs, it's a terrible place to be. But that is the decision. So one of my points I'll make to a client is that in the immediate present, you live to fight another day and maybe something happens. But the more dangerous answer for the country, the one that worries me a lot, is that there was always a very strong relationship between growth, jobs, and support for the ANC. Contrary to what the left said about Mbeki, you mustn't think I'm a great fan of the man. I'll credit him with what he did right. His era was not an era, well, let's go from Davos, when he was essentially already the prime minister, to when he was kicked out at 15 years at Polokwane. We didn't have jobless growth in South Africa. We actually almost doubled the number of people in employment. When that happened, growth got up to 5%. I said earlier, the deficit was cut in half. The deficit became a surplus. Debt was cut in half. ANC support rocketed. And in 2004, a decade after liberation, after Mandela, the ANC is a good 6 or 7 percentage points stronger than when Mandela had led the party. That is an amazing insight. It was because the country was getting better, doing well, successful. The ANC did much better in governing South Africa in the first decade than it was given credit for. It doubled the number of people with jobs. Service delivery was actually quite successful. The murder rate was cut in half. I was once accused of being better at this than Mac Maharaj when he was Jacob Zuma's spokesperson, which I enjoyed hearing. But it's important because it's true. And ANC support really took off. In the second decade, then I'll say why. The economy tanks. We don't create jobs at all, many, and we see on housing, an indicator like that the proportion of families in shacks is rising again. The ANC gets smoked in elections. It's in real trouble, as I've set out. Why? It was aspirations. In the first decade after democracy, people had aspirations that their lives would get better. And they did, more so than the ANC was credited with. It did very well in many areas and badly in others, but on balance, given what we've lived through the last decade, I bite your arm off to go back to where we were. And we were critical of Mbeki. But it was a golden age relative to what came next, which is, I suppose, the lesson. The aspirations were being met. We did not have jobless growth. We did not have trickle-down economics. We did not have failed service delivery. Race relations did not become worse than they'd been under apartheid. Crap. Sold by our mainstream media to the country as the truth. And it did terrible damage as a consequence. The second decade, people had these great aspirations and they weren't met. So they, instead of rewarding the government, punished the government.
Right.
Where this sinister ANC now can win the thing is it does happen if you become a country that becomes so poor that you are a hungry person. You don't have the luxury of aspirations anymore. You're just tired and hungry and fed up and very, very sad. And if some populist comes along and promises you a new BMW on your farm, you might say, what the hell? Why not? This sinister business of running the country into the ground can pay political dividends in seeing ANC support again recover if the driving into the ground is so terrible and so deep that a considerable proportion of people just become desperate. really desperate, truly hungry, as would happen under a policy of expropriation. And that, what leads us here is understanding history as much as anything else. But I'd mentioned to you the indicator that amongst people who are unemployed and have stopped looking for work, you don't get a more desperate person than that. Support for the ANC is the highest we can put it in any of our polling at the moment. To the clients, and the point for us is always, don't think the politicians are nuts. Don't see the world through the prism that don't try and see their world through your prism. You're in business, you run a bank, a successful newspaper, because when you meet a hindrance, you make a plan and you set it right and you do better and you grow your enterprise. But there is what will not apply to business or the media. There is a political option of scorched earth that may see your popularity rise again. So what the decrepit side of the ANC is doing is not mad, insane, stupid. They, as clients would say, these people don't understand the economy. They understand much better often than the critic does. And if we're to avoid this, the critical importance is not to allow aspirations in our country to die. You've got to sell the message that your life can get better. And when we in the present hear business leaders saying, well, we still talk about getting South Africa back to the emerging market average rate of growth, 5%, 4.5%. People say it's impossible, too difficult. We say, let's bring the unemployment rate down to emerging market norms, which we could do in 20 years here if we grew the economy fast enough. We get told it's too ambitious.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a dangerous mindset for influential people to get into, because you're going to feed the desperation of very large numbers of people who do not have any serious shot at a better life anymore. They had that before. And if that group increases in size to a sufficient quantum, you can see ANC support rise through an era of real economic collapse. And that is the sort of, particularly if the EFF comes back in, these are the kinds of scenarios that would work towards the left of our top left to an extent.
Yeah.
Bottom left once the EFF comes back after an ANC defeat, etc.
Yeah. So I mean, the scary part there is exactly like you said, the top right scenario. I think it's a bottom right scenario where you said the EFF comes in and they basically reform the country in a positive way that grows the economy, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't be the EFF there. There, I would see a new centre-right kind of political movement, resonates with mainstream opinion, comes in. Perhaps it's there've been some DA people around in the past who've thought that perhaps the better parts of the DA, which mustn't be overstated, right, the extent of that, gets together with the better parts of the ANC.
Yeah,
right. It's a rather small group at the moment, but bold and good people.
Yeah.
They get together with the it's kind of a sort of evangelical, slightly center-right, black conservative coalition of sorts, sort of what Herman Mashaba envisages but doesn't have the ability to pull off. That's bottom right. Bottom left is the ANC losers.
Yeah. And
the EFF says, and now what are you guys going to do?
No, exactly.
And they're desperate ANC, and the EFF can name its price. We'll come back. We'll bail you out.
Yeah, but the thing is that
over in Lutuli House.
The part that's kind of confusing to me is that we already have scenarios. We already have center-right parties that have existed for quite a long time. Like I think the ACDP identifies as a center-right party. That's also a black majority party. The Ikantha Freedom Party is also one of those. Why aren't they capitalizing on this political vacuum? Like, could a party like that, could you imagine that finally bringing the death knell to the ANC, be a potential alliance between two parties by a popular Christian leader, that type of scenario? Or does it have to be the good part of the ANC and the DEA that actually win this?
I don't think the messages are right on any of those. I mean,
Okay.
Carter was once very important. Buthelezi, I think, is a very great man. He'll never get the credit due to him. Now trying to save in his dotage the Zulu nation from an internal implosion that might see it wither into something weaker than it's been, and well, really since its high point. If you can call what happened in those decades a high point, which you couldn't if you were a liberal Democrat. The ACDP message, I don't think, is right on the economy. It doesn't have the reach. I mean, I wouldn't have come across it in my work in recent years in any substantive way to make me think it was significant enough to mention something to a client about it. So you need, the message needs to be right. You need significant financial resources behind it, and you need very unique and charismatic leadership. You're asking a lot, therefore.
Exactly.
But it's a free country. Sentiment is centre right in the main, not in the right sense of the word. You know, people don't understand the meaning of words anymore. Centre right is good. That was what the ANC was after 94. This is how you get to a budget surplus. Doesn't mean you galloped on a horse around Church Square waving some unpopular flag over your head. It's a centre-right country in the main. That's where sentiment is. It's a free country. You can say whatever you want. There's a lot of money sloshing around looking for a political home, mostly misspent on political adventures that will come to nothing, as the Zondo Commission testimony of Mr. Ramaphosa will, in the fullness of time, reveal, I'm sure. So the pieces are there. If we weren't a free country, I would say you can't pull this off. If the populists were Marxist revolutionaries, I'd say it's probably too difficult. If we were bankrupt and there was no one had any money to spend on a political solution, I would say I don't see how it's going to happen. We have those things. We just have never. It's the great unmet challenge of South African politics. Maybe we do it this time. It's a sort of charge of the Light Brigade politically, the sort of Hail Mary pass, if you understand football in America. The great unmet challenge is at the point of the crisis to unite that moderate middle, which has been led to believe for decades that it exists in racially exclusive enclaves. Unite that moderate middle around basic, decent values. That's all that it is. If that happens, the country that emerges is a wonderful place to live in. Because confidence has been lost in the existing political actors, there are now far more people who could vote but don't than the number of people who vote for the ANC, for example. There's a huge market out there. And because of the desperation economically of the past decade, worsened by these lockdowns that did such terrible damage, there's a hunger for a solution. So I could tell you that we are closer to this elusive point than we have ever been as a country. You just need the financing, the moderate public opinion, and the freedom to express yourself, to come together in one important moment, and you have South Africa's solution.
Do you think, because I know for a fact that there's a lot of people that have this center-right mentality that would like to have a party that shares these values that you now, that you allude to, but they don't feel like a party because I don't know if they know that they're in the majority. I think that might be the scenario, is they don't know that they're in the majority. So then they think that my values, my core values, and a party that might exist in one of the independents that fits their values is not going to win. So I'm just going to vote like the opposition party. So I'm just going to vote DA. And now that the DA is kind of, they're increasingly disappointing these group of voters specifically, and therefore they're losing support of it. Do you think that they could perhaps redefine themselves, regain their former glory, and then win this group if they were to perhaps combine with some of the elements, the right elements of the ANC, and then use their centrist approach? So in that case, they wouldn't be center-left, which is what they currently are, but they would turn into center-right, that they could actually regain the popular vote and continue to garner support and grow. Is that a realistic scenario?
I think, look, there are, first, before I tell you why I don't think it is, tremendous people in the DA who you should be so grateful that they do what they do, and in parts of the ANC, I can tell you too, although fewer and fewer in both parties. But they know who they are. They're not the types that get upset by what we're about to say. I don't think the DA is possessed of the caliber of leadership in the main now. The exceptions, good evening, and you know who you are.
Yeah.
To pull that off anymore. I think there was an opportunity a decade ago. And, to miss an opportunity, never miss an opportunity, to miss an opportunity becomes the epitaph.
Yeah.
I think there was, but I think the damage was great. I think it can recover, it can stabilize, can do all of that. And that remains hugely important to the country now. An opposition that holds back the rapacious appetites of some in the government and the ruling establishment. You must be very grateful that those people exist. Otherwise, the position would be intolerable.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I don't think it can do more than that now. And my sense evermore is that if the moment happens, this great reformation, the uniting of the middle around pragmatic center-right to distinguish them from everything else ideas, I think we're going to have to see the rise of something new. Fortunately, in my work, in what I do, we deal with the impossible all the time, because it's when the impossible happens that our clients get into the deepest trouble.
Yes.
And when the client says impossible, young analysts are like, it must be that one.
Yeah.
They say. And if the client says, surely the government won't, then the young analysts say, this is exactly what the government is going to do, isn't it? So there are these rules of thumb, and they're very good. You can make them your investment strategy, and you'll become very rich.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be a new entity from the pragmatic center right. The search for it is the circumstances must first be correct. I think you need hope to be lost in the political options people once trusted.
Yeah.
So that's a necessary part. Until hope is lost in the ANC, and frankly now in Mr. Ramaphosa, you're not getting to that solution. So the moment that hope is lost, very important moment, but you must then have a great influence on public opinion, so it doesn't go radical left.
Exactly. It's like you said at the start. It's a group that is in control of the public opinion that will make use of this and gain, in exactly those moments.
This is poorly understood by the right of the divide as opposed to the left. The left knows the stuff brilliantly well. They're very good at it. That's why they're so interested in newspapers and censoring the internet and free speech. The right side of the debate, let's say the capitalist side, It's never bothered much to invest much in its own sustainability in the realm of ideas. But the reason why fascist dictatorships shoot people like you and me, burn books, and censor the internet is because they know how very dangerous a conversation like this is.
Yeah.
Because someone might hear it.
Yeah.
They might say, well, this is very interesting. Natan Sharansky, we'll get into a little bit later. I don't want to go there now. I'm going to mislead you too much. But the point I was going to make for you is that Biko, let's use him because it's shorter, in standing in front of a magistrate, is quizzed about black consciousness and said to the man, "What is the matter, my lord? Are you afraid of an idea?" And they were. And the Nats murdered Biko because of his idea. And the ANC murdered his political movement because they were just as afraid, if not more so, than the Nats were of what Biko was telling people in I write what I like, and black man, you're on your own, which is not far off the charts to centre-right, or in the proper sense, conservative political thought. Get the state out of your life, do whatever you want, and live your life on your own terms, which is really the message. And in that respect, there was always a very interesting resonance between black consciousness and classical liberalism in South Africa. Yeah. And alien to any political writer in the country today who works for a newspaper, except for our newspaper. Those two philosophies actually had a much closer relationship than I think many first-year political students, science students in South Africa, let alone their lecturers or the vice-chancellors of their universities, would ever believe.
Yeah. No, exactly. I want to end off, because we're coming up on an hour. I want to end up with a question that's a bit of a spanner in the tire, but I think it's quite interesting. Is we have this scenario in South Africa where it kind of like pops up every now and then, and the thing I'm talking about is immigration, and it's kind of like the sleeping tiger that's waiting to be a pivotal figure in South African politics. Because every now and then we have a scenario where immigration comes up as a very, very hot debate, and xenophobia connected to it, and then it kind of dies down almost quickly as it rises up in the way that it's replaced by another popular narrative. A recent study showed that close to, like, I think it's 70% of South Africans don't consider immigrants to be a positive effect on the country. Can like a future party capitalize on this, like one led by Mashaba, for example? And is this a storm that's kind of awaiting the ANC and the EFF and their continued support of the movement, freedom of movement in the African Union?
Well, I mean, we can answer that through the prism of America, where the most appalling aspect of Mr. Trump's policies was the idea of building a wall.
Yes.
And I think by far the strongest aspect of the Biden policy offering to America is to throw open America to immigrants. Well, quite what Biden's going to do with the mess on the southern border, it's difficult to say now. Groot gemors. But a former politician, European politician, recalled a conversation with the former governor of the Federal Reserve in America, where he asked this man, the European asked the American, what explained the great success of America's economy in your time. And the man said, 1 million illegal immigrants a year was absolutely critical. We couldn't say so, of course, so we found some other things. Immigrants are tremendous people. They're risk takers. They're entrepreneurs. They've got off their asses in terrible situations to walk to find a better life. I mean, just imagine the driving force behind that. If you're Somali in South Africa and you walked here. I mean, that I'd employ that chap straight away. I mean, this is what you want. Immigrants are consumers of goods and services. They bring entrepreneurial activity to countries. My colleague Rian Malan, who you should interview one evening because he's tremendous and is never interviewed by anyone because he's hard to pin down, did work for us on Ethiopians in the city of Johannesburg, traders. Inspiring people, building businesses from nothing. And what is the policy view here? it's put them on a train and take them back to Komati Poort or try and lock them up at the Lindela Patriation Camp, which is essentially a concentration camp for entrepreneurs, and hold these people up to be drug dealers, rapists and murderers, not far off Donald Trump's description of Mexicans at one point. And I think that's entirely wrong. The foreign immigrants to South Africa who came here with nothing and do well, and there are very many of them, otherwise you wouldn't come. It's market economics. You won't come if life gets worse. The case studies must be read and understood, because these immigrants show that there is a path out of poverty in the South African economy for poor South Africans too, if they learn the lessons. And what is the major difference between an immigrant here, illegal, jumped over the fence, and they say you mustn't use the term an illegal immigrant, but the state thinks the guy is illegal. I don't know what else you must describe him as. I mean, I think he's a wonderful asset to the country, but state still wants to arrest him and lock him up. What's the difference? That legal immigrant is not subject to the laws and the regulations governing the economy. He is actually free. He's free from the stranglehold of the cabinet and the state planners and the state industrial policy and BEE and whatever else liberates people, labor markets, minimum wages. The chap comes here and does really, really well. Firstly, you've got to admire anyone that does that. Secondly, you've got to say your example is, from a policy perspective, one of the most valuable ingredients we have to turn this country around. And central to that example is actually the further you get the state away from, Reagan's famous quote, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." The further in South Africa a person is away from the government that's trying to help them, the better the odds are that their life is going to improve. And that is a very important lesson.
It is an incredibly important lesson. I'm so glad we actually touched on that one, or we got to that one to touch on it as well, because it's really interesting perspective that I don't think a lot of I want to say it's not center right. It's like more right side of the spectrum would actually agree with that sentiment. But given the reasoning that you mentioned for it, I think it actually should garner a lot of support and a lot of admiration for these people. Before we end off, I just want to give you the floor one last time. Anything you want to plug or add before we send this off?
No, thank you to yourselves. If your viewers found this at all interesting, you can go to Google the Center for Risk Analysis South Africa. There's a YouTube channel run by my colleague David Ansara. Give you a little insight into what we do. And if you find that stuff interesting, we do individual subscriptions now, not just big corporations. And we would like to hear from you. So thank you, Petrus, and your colleague Donald. I really appreciate being on this evening, and I hope we will see you again.
No, we definitely will, yeah, and we'll reach out a bit. We'll definitely put all of the links that you've now mentioned in the description for people to really easily find it, so they can definitely go and explore it there. And to our viewers, I mean, if you like this discussion, just like Dr. Cronje said, please by all means like this video. It helps share his message and makes it more popular by getting it picked up by the YouTube algorithm. And of course, us as a YouTube channel, it also helps out quite a bit. So thank you so much for watching. This has been WorldView.